Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Today I invite you into a story that echoes across the dawn of myth itself, a tale born not from a single hero's longing for home, but from prophecy, divine cruelty, and a destiny that no wall, no sea, and no king could imprison. This is not merely the legend of a monster slain. It is the story of fate defied, innocence betrayed, and courage forged under the merciless gaze of the gods. In this epic, destiny descends as prophecy, fear wears a crown, and the will of Olympus moves through gold, blood, and stone. At its heart stands a young man marked by the heavens before he ever chose to be a hero, a child cast into the sea, raised by mercy, and driven toward an impossible task. If there is a myth that captures the raw tension between divine injustice and mortal resolve, a tale that resurrects the primal terror and wonder of the archaic world, it is the story of that youth who faced horror not with brute force, but with clarity of mind and precision of will. He walks the edge between God and man, guided by wisdom, armed by strategy, and tested by fear itself. He is the embodiment of destiny sharpened by intellect, of courage disciplined by restraint. He is the hero who dared to confront the gaze that turns life into stone, Perseus, slayer of Medusa. Disclaimer: the visuals in this video were created using artificial intelligence. There are no bloody or excessively graphic scenes. However, some moments have been designed for cinematic and emotional depth. If you are sensitive to such imagery, please consider this before watching. If you wish to join me on these legendary journeys, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, turn on the notification bell, and leave a comment below telling me which story you'd like to hear next. I look forward to exploring these timeless tales together with you on every adventure. Take another deep breath, relax your mind, and let the rhythm of the waves guide you. Wishing you a peaceful sleep, the epic journey begins now. One of the oldest settlements in the ancient Greek world, the kingdom of Argos, its walls built of massive stone blocks, was ruled at that time by King Acrisius, a man consumed by power and authority. Acrisius was so ruthless in securing his throne and eliminating rivals that he had even driven his own brother Proetus into exile after endless internal conflicts. Yet, despite all the splendor of his reign, the strength of his armies, and the wealth of his palace, there was one absence that robbed Acrisius of sleep and gnawed at his mind like poison. He had no male heir to carry on his name and inherit his legacy. No matter how hard he and his wife Eurydice tried, the gods had not granted them a son. They had only one child, their extraordinarily beautiful daughter Danaë. As the years passed, this lack became an obsession. Desperate to learn what the future held and what the gods intended for his bloodline, Acrisius decided to consult the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, one of the most sacred and terrifying sites of the ancient world. After a long and exhausting journey, in the mist-filled air of the temple, the oracle whispered a prophecy that would plunge his life into eternal darkness. Acrisius would never have a son. but his daughter Danaë would bear a male child, and that grandson would one day kill Perseus himself. The king returned to Argos in terror. Although believing one could escape fate was the greatest illusion of mortals, Perseus was determined to try. Silencing his conscience to save his own life and prevent the prophecy from coming true, he devised a cruel and calculating plan. He decided to imprison his only child, the young Danaë, in a place where no man could ever touch her, where even sunlight could barely reach. Beneath the courtyard of his palace, deep underground, he had a massive chamber of bronze constructed. In some accounts, this is described as an impregnable tower rising toward the sky. Danaë was locked inside this metal prison with only an elderly nurse to attend to her basic needs. The chamber's single window looked only toward the sky, and Perseus believed that by condemning his daughter to a lifetime cut off from humanity, he had outwitted fate itself. But the locks and bronze walls of mortal kings meant nothing to Zeus, king of the gods on Mount Olympus. From his throne, Zeus looked down upon the world and noticed Danaë's incomparable beauty as she sat sorrowfully in the cold silence of the bronze chamber, and he fell instantly in love with her. No matter how thick the walls or how heavy the doors guarding her were, they could not stand in the way of Zeus's desire. To overcome this impossible barrier and reach Danaë, Zeus chose a divine form never seen before. He transformed himself into a rain of gold. One night, Danaë saw shimmering liquid droplets of gold pouring down through the small opening in the ceiling of her prison. This was no ordinary natural event. The sacred light that filled the room wrapped the cold metal in a divine warmth. The golden particles flowed into Danaë's lap like a river, and from this miraculous union, the princess became pregnant by Zeus. Fate itself, transformed into a rain of gold, had slipped into the king's deepest dungeon and rendered all of Perseus's precautions meaningless. Fearing her father's wrath, Danaë carried out her pregnancy in absolute secrecy. In the silence of the bronze chamber, she gave birth to a baby boy and named him Perseus. The young Perseus, bearing the radiance and strength of divine blood, was hidden and raised for 4 years within this metal cage by his mother and nurse. One day, however, as Perseus passed near the bronze chamber, he was startled by the sound of joyful laughter, clearly the voice of a child, not an adult. Bursting into the prison, the king experienced the greatest shock of his life when he saw a small boy playing beside his daughter. No matter how much Danaë insisted that the child's father was the god Zeus, who had come to her in the form of a golden rain, Perseus refused to believe it. He thought the entire affair must be either a deception or a plot devised by his exiled brother Polydectes. The small child standing before him was the very embodiment of the prophecy that foretold his death. Perseus now faced a horrifying dilemma. He wanted to kill both his daughter and his grandson outright, but he was terrified of committing one of the greatest taboos of the ancient world, shedding the blood of one's own family. If he were to kill them himself, he knew he would incur the wrath of the Erinyes, the Furies, who would pursue him relentlessly until they drove him mad. Determined not to become a direct murderer, yet eager to rid himself of them forever, Perseus devised a cruel and deceitful solution. He locked Danaë and the young Perseus inside a wooden chest and ordered it cast into the sea, leaving them to the mercy of the violent waves. As the king watched the chest drift away from the shore, shrinking to a mere speck amid towering waves, he was convinced that he had buried both the prophecy and his fears in the depths of the sea. Yet this act marked not the end, but the beginning of Acrisius's downfall, and the first step in the epic journey of Perseus, a journey destined to echo across the world. That bronze chamber buried deep beneath Argos had sheltered a silent miracle for 4 years. While King Acrisius believed he had imprisoned his daughter and his future executioner underground, behind metal walls, fate had already begun to echo through the corridors of the palace. One day, as the king walked across the courtyard, he was startled by a cheerful child's voice rising from the depths of the earth, a sound clearly not belonging to an adult. To Acrisius, it rang like a death knell. Gathering his guards, he stormed the dungeon, and there before him he saw his daughter Danaë, her beauty undiminished, and beside her his 4-year-old grandson, Perseus, glowing with a divine radiance. Acrisius's rage was even greater than his fear. With a trembling voice, Danaë explained that the child had not been conceived by any mortal man, but had been born when Zeus himself, king of the gods, slipped into the chamber in the form of a rain of gold. But Acrisius was a man whose heart had darkened with suspicion. He dismissed the story as either a lie invented by his daughter or a cunning scheme devised by his exiled brother Proetus. The prophecy had taken flesh and now stood before him. This child would grow up and kill him. Dark thoughts churned in the king's mind. He wanted to slaughter the little Perseus and his mother on the spot, but one of the most terrifying laws of the ancient world held him back. He knew that spilling the blood of his own kin would bring upon him the endless wrath of the Erinyes, the Furies, goddesses of vengeance. To be branded a family murderer meant being hunted by these whip-bearing spirits until madness consumed him. And so, he found a way to rid himself of them without becoming a direct killer, to abandon them to the hands of nature. The palace carpenters were ordered to build a massive chest from solid oak. It had to be as narrow as a coffin, yet as sturdy as a ship. On a dark and stormy night, Danaë and little Perseus were locked inside this wooden cage despite their cries. As Acrisius drew heavy bronze bolts across the lid, he believed he was sealing the door of fate itself. The chest was carried to the violent shores of Argos. Standing on wave-battered rocks, the king watched his daughter and grandson being sent toward death. When the chest was pushed into the sea, the cold darkness of the water swallowed them at once. Inside the pitch-black chest, Danaë could hear nothing but the terrifying roar of the waves and the crash of water against the wooden boards. Clutching little Perseus tightly to her chest, she whispered silent prayers so that her child would not be afraid. Like a fragile nutshell at the mercy of the sea, the chest vanished and reappeared among towering waves, sinking and rising again. As Acrisius stood proudly on the shore, he watched the chest disappear beyond the horizon, convinced that the prophecy had been buried beneath the waters. But Zeus had seen this cruelty from his throne on Olympus. He could not allow the child of his own blood, or the woman he loved, to perish. Zeus called out to his brother Poseidon, the absolute ruler of the seas. At his brother's request, Poseidon struck the ocean with his trident and calmed the raging waves, turning them as gentle as a quiet harbor. The winds, instead of sinking the chest, began to guide it softly. For days and nights, the chest drifted onward, gliding across the blue expanse of the Aegean Sea. At last, it reached the shores of the island of Seriphos, known for its rocky coastlines and peaceful coves. At that moment, a kind-hearted and humble fisherman named Dictys was on the beach, repairing his nets. He noticed a strange object shimmering on the water as it washed ashore. Approaching it with curiosity, he realized this was no ordinary chest, but a massive box bearing the marks of royal seals. Using his nets, he dragged the chest onto the sand with great effort. When Dictys forced open the bronze bolts, he froze in astonishment. Inside was not a corpse awaiting death, but a woman, exhausted, yet still extraordinarily beautiful, and in her arms a small child whose eyes shone like stars. Danaë and Perseus were miraculously alive. Dictys welcomed the two strangers with great compassion. He gave them water and food and soothed their fears. The fisherman Dictys took them into his home and offered them shelter. He had no children of his own and chose to embrace Perseus as if he were his son, teaching him about the sea and about life. After the suffocating bronze dungeon of Argos, Danaë and Perseus began a new life in the free, salt-scented air of Seriphos. Yet Seriphos would bring not only peace, but new storms as well. For Dictys' brother, the ambitious and ruthless king of the island, Polydectes, would soon learn of the beauty of this mysterious woman. Having escaped the dark, damp bronze dungeon of Argos, and then the massive wooden chest in which she had felt death breathing down her neck, Danaë opened her eyes on the island of Seriphos, beneath the bright sun of the Aegean and the sharp scent of salt in the air. The man who found them on the shore and pulled them back from the grasp of death, Dictys, appeared to be a humble fisherman, but in truth he was the son of Magnes and a naiad nymph, and thus of noble origin. Unlike his brother, King Polydectes, Dictys was free of royal ambition, a man who found peace in the sea and in his nets, gentle of spirit and rich of heart. When he forced open the chest's heavy bronze bolts, he discovered not a corpse, but an exhausted yet still breathtakingly beautiful princess, and in her arms a small child glowing with divine light. Dictys welcomed the mysterious woman and her son with great compassion. He took them under his protection, brought them into his home, and began to raise young Perseus as if he were his own child. As the years passed swiftly along the rocky shores of Seriphos, Perseus proved more and more that he was no ordinary boy. The divine blood of Zeus flowing through his veins granted him strength, speed, and intelligence far beyond what mortals could possess. While other children played games on the sand, Perseus single-handedly dragged massive fishing boats onto shore and combined the seafaring skills taught by Dictys with an almost supernatural power. Physically, he grew into a tall, imposing, fearless, and striking young man. Yet this physical greatness was balanced by an unshakable loyalty to his mother, Danaë, and a fierce instinct to protect her. Danaë still bore the scars of the traumas she had endured in Argos, and her son became both her sole refuge and her shield against the outside world. However, the island of Seriphos was not as peaceful as it appeared. Its absolute ruler, King Polydectes, was a man of dark desires and insatiable ambition, utterly unlike his brother Dictys. From the moment Danaë first set foot on the island, her unique and noble beauty seized the king's mind like a poison. Polydectes became obsessed with possessing Danaë and making her his queen. Time and again he proposed marriage to her, promising to lay all the riches of his palace at her feet. Danaë, however, was determined never again to open her heart to any mortal, and she rejected the king's persistent and at times coercive advances with firm resolve every single time. As time went on, Polydectes' desire curdled into a quiet, venomous rage. For standing before him now was no longer just a silent, sorrowful woman, but a powerful Perseus who defended his mother like a lion. Whenever the king attempted to approach Danaë, Perseus appeared as an immovable barrier, his divine radiance and unwavering resolve unsettling Polydectes. The king understood that as long as Perseus remained on the island, he would never be able to bend Danaë to his will or take her by force. Perseus had become not only an obstacle, but a direct threat to Polydectes' authority and desires. Standing on the marble balcony of his palace and gazing down at the fisherman's quarter, Polydectes began to devise a way to rid himself of this young man. Killing Perseus outright was too dangerous. He feared the reaction of the people and the wrath of his brother Dictys. He needed a plan in which Perseus would march toward death of his own accord, driven by his courage and pride, and never return. The king knew that heroes often became victims of their own promises. He decided to turn Perseus's youth and overconfidence in his strength into a weapon. The scheme taking shape in his mind was to send Perseus to face the most terrifying creature in the world, the Gorgon Medusa. Unaware of these sinister plans, Perseus continued to train among the island's jagged cliffs, sensing that fate was preparing him for a great trial. The unnameable longing for heroism within him pushed him beyond the calm waters of Seriphos, toward adventures so fearsome that even the gods would tremble at their names. The sunny days of Seriphos were merely the calm before the storm. When Polydectes' treacherous trap and the destiny prepared by the gods for Perseus finally converged, one of the greatest heroic epics in the history of the world was about to begin. On the sunlit shores of Seriphos, peace was slowly giving way to a subtle tension spreading from the palace of King Polydectes. The king's desire for Danaë had grown beyond concealment and had become a whispered secret in the palace corridors. Danaë continued to reject every marriage proposal and every display of wealth Polydectes offered, as if they were acts of generosity. But Polydectes, as a ruler, was not accustomed to being refused, and he knew that the greatest obstacle before him was Perseus, a young man who, strengthened day by the divine power of Zeus, was becoming ever more formidable. Perseus never left his mother's side, standing like an impenetrable shield that prevented the king from approaching Danaë by force. Polydectes understood that he could not defeat Perseus in open conflict, nor could he kill him outright, without provoking the anger of the people and of his brother, the fisherman Dictys. For this reason, he decided to devise a plot that would use the young man's hunger for heroism and his pride against him, a scheme that would send Perseus willingly toward his own death. The king announced that he would hold a grand banquet, supposedly to gather gifts for his marriage to Hippodamia, the daughter of King Oenomaus of Pisa. This was merely a pretext. In truth, Polydectes desired no woman but Danaë. Pretending to court Hippodamia, however, was the perfect cover to lure Perseus into his trap. When the day of the banquet arrived, all the nobles and wealthy men of Seriphos gathered in the great hall of the palace. By custom, any guest attending such a gift-gathering ceremony was expected to present the king with something valuable, most notably a magnificent horse. The hall filled with the scent of wine, with laughter, and with the neighing of fine horses brought by the nobles. Perseus was also invited to the feast, but having grown up with a fisherman and possessing no wealth of his own, he had neither a horse nor gold to offer the king. Polydectes waited for the right moment to highlight Perseus's helplessness before everyone. As the nobles stepped forward one by one to present their prized horses and receive praise, the turn finally came to Perseus. The king fixed him with a sly smile. Unwilling to be crushed beneath those humiliating eyes, Perseus rose to his feet, driven by the untamed pride inherited from the blood of Zeus. "I have no horse to give you, my king," he said, his voice echoing through the hall, "but I trust my strength and courage so completely that if you wish, I can bring you something far greater than any horse could, even the head of the dreadful Gorgon Medusa, who turns men to stone with a single glance." A deep silence fell over the hall. The guests thought the young man either mad or desperate for death. Polydectes, however, felt a great inner triumph as he saw his trap snap shut exactly as planned. The king immediately accepted this open promise and condemned Perseus to an impossible task. "Since you have said it, I command you to keep your word," he declared. Polydectes' intent was clear. No mortal had ever gone to Medusa's lair and returned alive, and he was certain Perseus would share the same fate, turned to stone. As Perseus left the palace, the crushing weight of what he had done pressed down upon him, and he walked toward the island's jagged cliffs. He knew well whom and what he was facing. Medusa had once been one of the most beautiful women in the world, and had fallen victim to the desire of the sea god Poseidon. While serving as a priestess in the temple of Athena, Medusa had been violated by Poseidon, and Athena, enraged by the defilement of her sacred space, had taken her anger out on the innocent woman. She transformed Medusa's famed beautiful hair into hissing, venomous snakes and twisted her face into something so terrifying that any living being who looked upon it directly was instantly turned to cold stone. Medusa lived with her two immortal sisters, Stheno and Euryale, in a cave at the edge of the world, as the monstrous beings known as the Gorgons. Perseus stood on the shore, staring out at the sea, with no weapon in his hands, no map, and no idea how he might defeat such a creature. The regret within him mingled with the deep pain of having left his mother Danaë defenseless in the grip of Polydectes. Yet he was not merely the son of a fisherman. He was the son of Zeus, king of the gods, and the eyes of Olympus were already fixed upon him. This moment of hopeless waiting was, in truth, the sacred silence in which one of the greatest heroic journeys in history along with divine aid, was about to begin, as fear in Perseus's heart blended with the acceptance of a demigod's fate. The first signs of the god's plan for him began to appear on the horizon. There was no turning back now. He would either return to Seriphos with Medusa's head and save his mother, or remain forever as a stone statue in some forgotten corner of the world. As Perseus left the palace of King Polydectes, amid the curious and pitying gazes of the people, he walked toward the jagged cliffs of Seriphos with an indescribable weight pressing upon his heart. He was still very young, and now he understood far more clearly how terrible a burden the promise he had made, driven by the pride flowing from the blood of Zeus, truly was, after being humiliated at that fateful banquet for lacking even a single horse. To bring back the head of the Gorgon Medusa was an impossible task, one that no mortal had ever accomplished. Even those who had dared to attempt it had been condemned to an eternal, stone-bound silence. Sitting on the rocky shore and staring at the waves crashing against the coast, Perseus was consumed by regret at having left his mother Danaë defenseless in the hands of that cruel king. Yet he was not merely a young man raised by a fisherman. He was the son of Zeus, king of the gods, and the eyes of Olympus had already turned toward this brave demigod. As the sun set and the shadows lengthened, Perseus's solitude was suddenly broken by a divine radiance. Before him appeared two magnificent figures, beings no ordinary mortal could ever behold. One was Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, with her helmet upon her head, a spear in her hand and gleaming armor upon her breast. The other was Hermes, the clever messenger of the gods, protector of roads and travelers, with winged sandals on his feet and a magical staff in his hand. Perseus fell to his knees before these divine presences, with awe mixed with terror, for his fate had now left the realm of mortals and entered the playing field of the gods. The gods valued Zeus's courageous son too highly to allow him to be devoured by Medusa without aid. Athena leaned close and whispered Perseus his first and most crucial lesson in a calm yet unshakable voice. To look directly upon Medusa's face meant instant transformation into cold stone. For this reason, the goddess extended to him a bronze shield she had forged with her own hands, polished to a mirror-like sheen. With this shield, Perseus would be able to turn his back to the monster, see her reflection, and strike while remaining protected from the lethal power of her gaze. Athena's gift was not merely an object, but also the strategic wisdom necessary to slay Medusa, for she herself had been both witness to and enforcer of the tragic transformation Medusa had suffered in her temple long ago. Next, Hermes stepped forward and placed in Perseus's hand an adamantine blade, sharp enough to sever Medusa's scale-covered neck in a single blow, crafted of diamond-hard metal, described in some accounts as a sickle. But Hermes' assistance did not end there. He knew that speed and invisibility would be vital on this journey. Hermes gave Perseus his own winged sandals, enabling him to glide through the air like a bird and swiftly reach the edge of the world where the Gorgons dwelled. The gods also bestowed upon him the helmet or cloak of invisibility belonging to his uncle Hades, which concealed its wearer even from the eyes of the gods themselves. Yet even these sacred weapons were not enough to complete the task. Perseus still needed a magical bag, a kibisis, in which he could safely carry Medusa's severed head. Rather than telling him directly where to find it and other enchanted items, Athena and Hermes traced out a mysterious route for him. They commanded Perseus to seek out the Graiai, the Grey Sisters, the only beings who knew this secret, who lived in a dark corner of the world. These three ancient women were sisters of the Gorgons, and only they knew the location of the nymphs who guarded the objects Perseus required. As Perseus rose into the air from Seriphos, bearing the divine shield in his hand, the adamantine sword at his side, and sandals at his feet that put the wind itself to shame, he was no longer merely a frightened youth. He was a hero equipped by Olympus. The guidance of Athena and Hermes had granted him not only physical power, but also faith in his destiny. Gliding through the endless blue of the sky toward the mist-shrouded cave of the Graiai, Perseus was ready to challenge the darkness into which even the gods hesitated to venture, in order to save his mother and keep his word. This journey was not only a quest to slay a monster, but the beginning of the forging of Zeus's son's own legend. Armed with the sacred gifts bestowed upon him by the gods, Perseus left behind the sunlit shores of Seriphos and set out toward the farthest edge of the world, toward dark lands where the sun rarely ventured and mist wrapped the earth like a burial shroud. On his feet were Hermes's winged sandals, swift enough to shame the wind. In his hand, Athena's shield, gleaming like a flawless mirror, and at his waist, the adamantine sword, capable of cutting even the hardest metals as if they were butter. Yet despite these tremendous powers, a formidable obstacle still stood before him. The location where Medusa was hiding and the whereabouts of the other enchanted objects he would need to defeat the monster remained a secret. The goddess Athena had whispered to him that the key to this secret lay with three ancient women known as the Graiai, or the Grey Witches. When Perseus reached a hidden cave beneath the frozen slopes of the Atlas Mountains, aided by his winged sandals, he encountered a strange and terrifying sight, one that ordinary mortals could scarcely endure. These women were the daughters of the sea deities Phorcus and Ceto, and they were sisters to the Gorgons themselves. Their names were Enyo, Pefredo, and Dino, and they were born old. Their hair had been grey from the day of their birth, and their bodies were covered in wrinkled skin that bore the weariness of thousands of years. What made the Graiai truly unique and profoundly vulnerable was the fact that the three of them shared only a single eye and a single tooth. They passed this one eye and tooth between them in turn, so that while one sister could see the outside world, the other two waited in darkness. Perseus, concealed by the absolute silence granted by his helmet or cloak of invisibility, hid within the shadows of the cave and waited patiently for the moment when this vital organ would be passed from one sister to another. The sisters' whispers echoed against the damp walls of the cave. As one called out to another, "It's my turn to see the world," Perseus knew the moment had come. Just as the eye was about to change hands, he lunged forward with swift precision and snatched the sisters' only connection to the world, the sacred eye and tooth, from the air. Instantly condemned to total darkness, the Graiai were seized by terrible panic. Clawing at the air and accusing one another, they begged for the return of their sole treasure. Perseus began to bargain, holding this priceless hostage in his hand. He ordered them to reveal where the other items required to kill Medusa could be found, if they valued their lives and their eye. At first, the Graiai resisted, for they wished to protect their sister Medusa, but the fear of being trapped in eternal darkness outweighed their loyalty. At last, they surrendered and described to Perseus the location of the nymphs who guarded the garden of the Hesperides. Only with these nymphs could he obtain the magical pouch called the Pegasos, in which Medusa's severed head could be safely carried, as well as Hades' helmet of invisibility and Hermes' sandals. According to some accounts, these items were in the nymph's possession. After receiving this invaluable information, Perseus kept his word and returned the eye and the tooth to the aged women. However, according to some versions of the tale, he hurled the eye into the nearby Lake Tritonis to prevent them from crossing his path again. Now knowing the route he had to follow, Perseus left the Graiai's mist-filled, gloomy cave behind and spread his wings toward the legendary garden where the nymphs of the west dwelled. This victory proved that Perseus was a true hero not only through brute strength, but also through intelligence and strategy. Ahead of him now lay the Garden of the Nymphs, the final stop before entering Medusa's lair, and beyond that, the dangerous journey into the very den of the Gorgons, where the greatest trial of all awaited him. Armed with the crucial knowledge he had wrested from the Graiai sisters, Perseus received from the nymphs of the west, the Hesperides, the magical pouch called the Pegasos, in which Medusa's severed head could be carried safely, the helmet of invisibility belonging to his uncle Hades, and Hermes' winged sandals. His equipment was now complete. With the divine pouch on his back, the helmet that concealed him even from the eyes of the gods upon his head, and the wind-defying sandals on his feet, he took flight toward the farthest edge of the world, the mist-laden foothills of the Atlas Mountains and the desolate coasts of North Africa. As he glided through the sky, he felt that the seas and lands passing beneath him were bearing witness to the birth of a hero, yet his true trial was only just beginning. At last he reached the dreadful valley where the sun's rays dared not enter, a place ruled by fog and damp shadows. The entrance to the cave was crowded with petrified bodies, standing like grim monuments whispering of the tragic fates of those who had come before. Perseus saw that not only humans, but also savage lions and other beasts, creatures that had accidentally met Medusa's gaze, had been condemned to eternal silence as cold stone statues. Though the sight sent a momentary chill through the young hero's heart, the blood of Zeus flowing in his veins, and the strategic counsel Athena had whispered to him, urged him onward. Deep within the cave, the three sisters known as the Gorgons, Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa, lay in a heavy sleep. Stheno and Euryale were immortal monsters, but Medusa alone was mortal. Once a woman whose beauty had even enchanted the sea god Poseidon, she had been cursed by Athena after the tragic assault she suffered in the goddess's temple. As Perseus moved through the damp corridors of the cave, he made no sound at all, protected by the helmet of invisibility. Yet he knew all too well that to look directly into Medusa's eyes meant certain death and instant petrification. At that moment, he gripped Athena's bronze shield, polished like a mirror, firmly on his left arm. Rather than looking directly at the monster, he used the shield's smooth surface as a mirror, guiding himself by the reflection of the sleeping creatures behind him. In the shield's image, the Gorgons were more terrifying than any mortal imagination could conceive, writhing, hissing, venomous snakes tangled together where hair should have been, massive tusks like those of wild boars, hands of bronze and wings of gold. By good fortune, Perseus noticed that even the snakes upon Medusa's head were asleep. Athena guided Perseus's sword hand with invisible force. He raised the adamantine blade, or sickle, given to him by Hermes, a weapon capable of slicing through even the hardest dragon scales as if they were butter. Guided solely by the reflection, he struck Medusa's scale-covered neck with a single swift and powerful blow. As the monster's head was severed from her body, one of the greatest wonders of the ancient world occurred. From Medusa's bleeding neck sprang forth the children she had borne to Poseidon. One was Pegasos, Pegasus, a winged horse as white as snow. The other was the warrior Graiai, born wielding a golden sword. Without hesitating in shock, Perseus immediately placed the still dangerous head of the monster into the kibisis, the magical pouch, and sealed it tightly. But with Medusa's death, her two immortal sisters, Stheno and Euryale, awoke from their sleep with a horrific scream. When they saw their sister's lifeless body and the spilled enchanted blood, they let out a terrible cry that shook the walls of the cave and set off in pursuit of the killer. Though they spread their wings and burst out of the cave after him, Perseus was completely invisible to them, thanks to the helmet of Hades upon his head. Climbing into the sky with lightning speed, Perseus escaped the clutches of the Gorgons. As his winged sandals carried him swiftly away from that dark land, the head of Medusa in his pouch seemed to grow heavier with every step, and the divine power it contained left traces wherever he passed. During his flight over the deserts of Libya, drops of blood seeping from Medusa's neck and dripping from the pouch touched the sands and instantly came to life, transforming into venomous snakes. For this reason, it is said that those lands of Africa have been filled with deadly serpents ever since. Bearing the proof of an impossible victory, Perseus began the long and perilous journey back to Seriphos, to save his mother and to set the fate of Argos in motion. The instant the head of the Gorgon Medusa was severed from her body by Perseus's single decisive blow, a moment unlike any other unfolded in one of the darkest caves of the ancient world, a moment where terror and miracle were intertwined. As the damp air of the cavern grew heavy with the warmth of divine blood flowing from the monster's neck, life emerged in one of its most magnificent forms immediately after death. From Medusa's severed neck burst forth the legendary horse Pegasos, Pegasus, white as snow, with wings wide enough to embrace the sky. This awe-inspiring being was the offspring of Medusa's tragic union with the sea god Poseidon, conceived long before she became a monster and carried like a dormant seed within her cursed body. finally freed only through her death. Alongside Pegasos, another being was born, Graiai, a towering warrior holding a golden sword in his hand. The silence of the cave, crowded with petrified victims, was shaken by the raw energy of these newly born divine figures. Perseus, still holding Medusa's head from which blood continued to seep, felt a brief moment of astonishment at the purity and majesty of the white-winged horse, yet he knew he could not linger. Medusa's immortal sisters, Stheno and Euryale, had awakened from their sleep and were already filling the depths of the cave with their screams as they searched for their sister's killer. Under the protection of the helmet of invisibility, Perseus watched as the newborn Pegasos beat his wings and rose toward the sky, while he himself used his winged sandals to put distance between him and this place of horror. As Pegasos glided toward the peaks of Olympus, an essential part of his destiny from his very first breath, Perseus followed a different path, continuing his perilous journey back to Seriphos. The birth of Pegasos was not merely the sign of a hero's victory, but also the beginning of art and inspiration. According to legend, when this miraculous horse later reached Mount Helicon, the home of the Muses, he struck the ground hard with his hoof, causing the sacred spring known as Hippocrene to burst forth. From that day on, this spring would become one of the most sacred sources of inspiration for poets and artists. For Perseus, however, this new era ushered in by Pegasos' birth also brought fresh dangers. The head of Medusa in his pouch still possessed a dreadful power, and drops of blood continued to seep from her neck, leaving marks wherever he passed. As Perseus flew over the deserts of Libya, the dark blood dripping from the magical pouch known as the Kibisis fell onto the scorching sands, and each drop instantly came to life, transforming into venomous snakes. It was said that the mingling of this divine and cursed blood with the earth was the reason these regions of Africa became forever filled with deadly serpents, drowning out the furious cries of the pursuing Gorgon sisters with the sound of the wind. Perseus sped westward. Pegasos disappeared among the clouds, winging his way toward his own divine fate. On one side was Medusa's severed head, the cold embodiment of death. On the other, Pegasos, the purest form of life and inspiration. With a single stroke of his sword, Perseus had altered the balance of the ancient world forever. The young demigod had not merely slain a monster with this weapon. He had set in motion a chain of events that would turn kings to stone, bring down a sea monster, and fulfill prophecies one by one. Having achieved the impossible victory of severing the head of the Gorgon Medusa, Perseus continued to glide through the sky, equipped with the helmet of invisibility belonging to his uncle Hades, the winged sandals of Hermes, and guided by the wisdom of Athena. The severed head of the monster, carried in the magical pouch known as the Kibisis, left traces across the lands he passed. As he flew over the deserts of Libya, drops of blood dripping from the neck fell onto the scorching sands and instantly transformed into deadly serpents. Riding on the back of the wind as he crossed the world, the young hero was unaware that his next great trial would soon become entwined with the fate of a princess chained in the lands of Ethiopia. The kingdom of Ethiopia was in those days a place shaken by the wrath of the gods, ruled by despair. Upon the throne sat King Cepheus and his wife, Queen Cassiopeia. The catastrophe had begun with Cassiopeia's pride and boastfulness regarding her beauty. The queen had claimed that she herself, or in some versions her daughter, was more beautiful than the sea nymphs known as the Nereids, thereby provoking the gods. The Nereids, exceedingly sensitive and possessive about their beauty, regarded this arrogance as a grave insult and brought their complaint before Poseidon, god of the seas. To punish the queen's transgression, Poseidon sent a devastating flood upon the kingdom and unleashed from the depths a monstrous sea creature named Cetus, which began to ravage the coasts of Ethiopia, devouring everything in its path. The people lived in terror. The monster destroyed fields and tore apart anyone it caught. In desperation, King Cepheus sought counsel from the oracle of Ammon to learn how the god's anger might be appeased. The answer he received was as cruel as the disaster itself. To silence the gods, the king's own daughter, the extraordinarily beautiful Princess Andromeda, had to be sacrificed to the sea monster. Crushed by the pressure of his people and the fear of watching his kingdom perish, Cepheus was forced to accept this dreadful demand, with tears in his eyes. Andromeda was chained with heavy iron shackles to a steep rock overlooking the sea and left alone to await the monster that would claim her. At that very moment, Perseus, gliding through the sky, noticed the unfortunate girl bound to the rocks. At first, her flawless and motionless form led him to believe he was gazing upon a marble statue, but her hair stirring gently in the wind and the tears streaming from her eyes revealed that she was a living human being. Andromeda's beauty captivated Perseus instantly, igniting a fire in his heart, unlike anything he had ever felt before. Descending to the shore on his winged sandals, Perseus approached the grieving king and queen. Introducing himself as the son of Zeus and the conqueror of Medusa, he declared that if he were to save their daughter from the monster, he would take Andromeda as his wife in return, and according to some accounts receive a portion of the kingdom, or a dowry. Having nothing left to lose, the sorrowful parents readily accepted these terms and even promised him the kingdom itself. As Andromeda watched in terror, the waters of the sea suddenly began to surge and rise like a massive wave. The sea monster Cetus approached, revealing its jagged teeth and scaly body. With a swift motion, Perseus leapt into the air and used the advantage of the sky, diving down upon the creature. Like an eagle attacking a serpent, he slashed deep wounds into the monster's scaly neck and back with his sword. Though the beast tried to seize Perseus while spewing water and dark purplish blood, it was helpless against the speed of the winged sandals. Bracing himself by gripping a rock with his left hand, Perseus drove the adamantine blade again and again into the monster's vital points, finally killing it. According to some versions of the tale, he instead used Medusa's head, turning the creature instantly to stone. After his victory, Perseus freed Andromeda from her chains. Yet before any celebration could begin, he was forced to set Medusa's head down upon the sand while washing his hands in the seawater. The divine power of the severed head instantly hardened the sea plants and branches it touched, turning them to stone. It is said that this was how coral first came into being, and that the sea nymphs spread this marvel throughout the oceans. As a sign of his glorious triumph, Perseus built 3 separate altars to the gods, Hermes, Athena, and Zeus, and offered sacrifices in their honor. The dark clouds that had gathered over the kingdom dispersed, giving way to preparations for a magnificent wedding. Yet this picture of happiness was soon stained with blood when Phineus, Andromeda's uncle and former betrothed, arrived at the palace. Though he had stood by in silence and watched the girl led toward death, he now demanded his claim by force, accusing Perseus of stealing his bride. In an instant, the wedding feast turned into a battlefield as Phineus and the large force he brought with him attacked Perseus with spears and arrows. As blood made the marble floors of the palace slick, Perseus fought alone against dozens of attackers under Athena's protection. But the number of enemies grew with every passing moment. Hundreds perished in the chaos, including the young warrior Atthis, the loyal Lycabas, and many other nobles. Realizing that he could not defeat this army by strength alone, Perseus resorted to a final measure. "Those who stand with me, close your eyes," he shouted as he drew Medusa's severed head from the magical pouch and raised it high. In that instant, time itself seemed to freeze within the palace of Ethiopia. Phineus and nearly 200 of his followers were turned into cold gray statues the moment they looked upon Medusa's eyes. Phineus remained forever as a stone monument, captured in a trembling, kneeling pose of terror. Thus Perseus protected both Andromeda and his own life. The path now lay open before him, back to Seriphos with his wife to rescue his mother Danaë, and then onward to Argos, the place where his fate had first been written. The union of Perseus and Andromeda marked the beginning of a happy chapter, one defined by lifelong fidelity and the founding of many heroic bloodlines to come. After his glorious victory on the shores of Ethiopia, having slain a sea monster and won the love of Princess Andromeda, Perseus spread his wings toward the island of Seriphos, driven by a longing to finally find peace. At his side was his loyal wife Andromeda, and in the magical pouch, Pegasos, he carried the head of Medusa, the greatest symbol of terror in the ancient world. Yet as the familiar rocky outlines of the island appeared on the horizon, Perseus sensed that the tranquil fishing village he had left behind was no more. In its place lay a land overshadowed by the insidious tyranny of King Polydectes. When the young hero set foot on the island, he was confronted with a far more painful sight than he had imagined. Taking advantage of Perseus's absence, Polydectes had transformed his obsessive desire for Danaë into open violence. The king had tried to force Danaë into marriage, and when she steadfastly rejected this dishonorable proposal, he intensified his pressure to an unbearable degree. Perseus's mother and the kind-hearted fisherman Dictys, who had raised him as a father, were driven to seek refuge at the altars of the gods to escape the king's fury and the threats to their lives. By ancient law, raising a hand against one who sought sanctuary in a temple was a grave sin. Yet this refuge was little more than an open-air prison. For the moment they stepped outside, they would fall into the hands of Polydectes' guards. When Perseus saw his mother's distress and how Dictys' honest life had been trampled by a tyrant, The blood of Zeus surged angrily through his veins. He was no longer merely a young man defending his mother. He had returned as a hero, armed by Olympus itself and favored by the gods. Meanwhile, Polydectes continued to plot behind the fortified walls of his palace, raising his cup to his own arrogance. The king was certain that Perseus had long since perished at the hands, or rather the gaze, of the Gorgon, for no mortal had ever entered Medusa's lair and returned alive. With measured steps, Perseus advanced toward the palace. In the great hall, Polydectes was hosting a feast with his loyal companions and nobles. As Perseus entered through the doors, a heavy silence fell. The king froze in shock at the sight of Perseus standing before him, alive and bearing the unmistakable splendor of the gods. But this shock quickly gave way to mocking insolence. Polydectes dismissed Perseus's tales of victory and adventure as idle stories and fabricated lies, attempting to humiliate him before the crowd. He loudly demanded proof of the promise Perseus had made, insisting on seeing Medusa's head, still wanting to believe that the pouch was empty and the hero had failed. Perseus realized that the end of this arrogant tyrant would come by his own demand. "If proof is what you desire, my king, then here is the gift I promised you," he declared. Then, turning to the innocent people in the hall so that his mother and Dictys' friends would not be harmed, he roared, "Close your eyes." It was a hero's final warning. He plunged his hand into the magical pouch and raised Medusa's severed head into the air, the serpents in her hair still hissing. In that instant, time froze within the palace of Seriphos. King Polydectes and all those who had shared in his cruelty were turned, the moment they looked upon those dreadful eyes, into cold stone statues, their faces locked forever in expressions of shock and terror. Polydectes paid the price for his ambition and arrogance by being eternally frozen by the very gift he had demanded. The throne room of Seriphos now stood filled with silent grey monuments to an unjust king and his followers. With the tyranny ended, Perseus's first act was to lead his mother Danaë and Dictys out from the sacred refuge where they had been hiding. The bond between them was so strong that Perseus entrusted the rule of the island to Dictys, the kind fisherman who had protected him and his mother in their darkest hours, and who, despite being the king's brother, had never strayed from justice. Dictys would now govern not a fishing boat, but a kingdom restored to peace. After this great victory, Perseus knew that his time on these lands had come to an end. The divine relics he carried had to be returned to their rightful owners. With unwavering loyalty, he sent back Hermes' winged sandals and Hades' helmet of invisibility. The fearsome head of Medusa, however, he presented to the wise goddess Athena, who had guided and protected him with her strategic insight. Athena accepted this terrible prize and placed it at the very center of her legendary shield, the Aegis. Thus, Medusa's head became both a symbol of Athena's power and a divine armor that continued to strike terror into her enemies. Having completed his task on Seriphos, saving his mother and restoring justice to the island, Perseus was now ready to confront his past. Together with Andromeda and Danaë, he set out for Argos, the land of his birth, ruled by his grandfather Perseus, who had once cast him and his mother adrift to die. The wheels of fate began to turn once more, for the dark prophecy spoken long ago awaited its moment of fulfillment, despite every attempt to escape it. Perseus, sword in hand, and loved ones at his side, was returning not as an exile, but as a legend to the land he had been forced to leave. Having restored justice on the island of Seriphos, turned the cruel Polydectes to stone through the force of his own arrogance, and freed his mother Danaë from captivity, Perseus was now stepping into a new phase of his life. With his loyal wife Andromeda at his side, and his mother Danaë, who had preserved her dignity despite all the suffering she had endured, he decided to return to Argos, the land where he had once been abandoned to death inside a wooden chest. Yet this journey was not merely a return home. It was also a final confrontation with the dark prophecy whispered years earlier by the Oracle of Delphi, a prophecy that had haunted the sleepless nights of his grandfather, Acrisius. By a strange twist of fate, news of Perseus's glorious victories and his return bearing the head of Medusa reached Argos long before he did. When King Acrisius learned that his grandson was not only alive, but had returned as a hero favored by the gods, his heart was seized once again by the relentless fear that had plagued him for years. The oracle had foretold that his grandson would kill him, and no matter how old he had become, Acrisius still clung to the futile hope that he might escape his fate. He was so terrified of facing his grandson and of seeing the prophecy fulfilled that just before Perseus arrived in Argos, he abandoned both his throne and his city and fled north to the city of Larissa in the lands of the Pelasgians. Acrisius believed that the farther he put between himself and his grandson, the safer he would be, unaware that humans often run straight toward their destiny. When Perseus reached Argos, he learned that his grandfather had fled in fear. His intention was not revenge. Perhaps he even wished to heal the deep wound left by the past and make peace with his grandfather, for he was now a man who acted with wisdom and stood as a ruler worthy of the gods' favor. Nevertheless, he did not abandon the search for Acrisius. He wished to find him and prove that the prophecy was nothing to fear, perhaps to dispel the dark shadows that clouded Acrisius's mind. At that time, King Teutamides of Larissa was holding a great athletic festival and funeral games in honor of his deceased father. The strongest and fastest men from across the Greek world gathered to compete in these contests. Perseus too decided to take part, to demonstrate his strength and skill. When the day of the games arrived, the stadium of Larissa was filled with an excited crowd. During the pentathlon, one of the most prestigious events, it was time for the discus throw. Holding the heavy metal discus in his hand, Perseus prepared to hurl it farther than anyone else, fueled by the divine power flowing through his veins. He took a deep breath, tensed his body, and threw the discus with all his might into the sky. But at that very moment, whether because the wind suddenly changed direction or because the gods themselves wished to complete the prophecy, the discus followed an unexpected path. The heavy metal disc veered off the field and struck an elderly man among the spectators on the head, according to some accounts on the foot. The man died instantly from the force of the blow. When Perseus ran toward the crowd in great distress, he realized with horror that the lifeless body lying on the ground was none other than his grandfather, Acrisius, who had disguised himself to avoid recognition. Acrisius, who had fled to foreign lands in an attempt to escape his fate, had been killed by the very person he was running from through a completely unforeseen accident. Despite every effort to avoid it, the prophecy had been fulfilled in the most tragic way. No mortal could escape what the gods had written. Perseus buried his grandfather with great respect just outside the city of Larissa. Yet the guilt and sorrow in his heart were beyond measure. Even though the death had been accidental, in ancient Greek tradition, the shedding of family blood, even the killing of a relative, was considered one of the gravest sins. For this reason, Perseus could not bring himself to claim the throne of Argos, a throne tied to his grandfather's death. He did not wish to rule a land where he would be remembered as a killer. In keeping with this honorable stance, he approached his cousin Megapenthes, the son of Proetus, king of Tiryns and Perseus's uncle, with a proposal. Perseus offered to give Megapenthes the kingdom of Argos, his rightful inheritance, in exchange for the smaller kingdom of Tiryns. Megapenthes accepted this exchange. Thus Perseus left Argos and became the ruler of Tiryns. Yet his vision did not end there. During his reign, he strengthened his power throughout the region. He founded and fortified the strategically important cities of Medea and, most notably, Mycenae, which would become famous for its legendary walls. It is said that to build the massive walls of Mycenae, constructed from stones so enormous that no human strength could move them, Perseus called upon the giant Cyclopes for assistance. Perseus and Andromeda lived a long and peaceful life in these lands. They had many children: Perses, from whom it is said the line of Persian kings descended, Alcaeus, Sthenelus, Helios, Mestor, and Electryon. This noble family became the ancestors of some of the greatest heroes in Greek mythology. From the lineage of Perseus would eventually come the birth of the greatest hero of all, Heracles, Hercules, the son of Zeus and Alcmene. The story of Perseus was a unique epic that began under the shadow of a prophecy, rose to its heights through divine assistance, and ultimately was crowned by a human tragedy and an honorable renunciation. He was not merely a warrior who slew monsters, but a true hero who accepted the inevitability of fate and placed the voice of his conscience above the ambition of kingship. The constellations of Perseus, Andromeda, Cepheus, and Cassiopeia continue to tell this great epic forever in the night sky. With the tragic accident at the athletic games in Larissa, where the discus he hurled caused the death of his grandfather Acrisius, the darkest prophecy of Perseus's life was finally fulfilled. No matter how far Acrisius had fled from his grandson, a sudden shift in the winds of fate had made him the target of that fatal throw. Perseus was overcome with profound sorrow and shame at having spilled his grandfather's blood, even though it had been entirely unintentional. In ancient Greek society, the shedding of a family member's blood, even by accident, was considered one of the gravest crimes and ritual pollutions. For this reason, Perseus refused to ascend the throne of Argos, which had been his by right. He could not bring himself to rule that city with his grandfather's blood on his hands. In order to free himself from this burden of conscience and to make a new beginning, Perseus proposed transferring the kingdom of Argos to his cousin Megapenthes, the son of his uncle Proetus. In return, he asked for Tyrins, the smaller kingdom ruled by Megapenthes. Megapenthes gladly accepted this exchange, and thus Perseus departed from Argos and became the new ruler of Tiryns. Yet Perseus's vision was not limited to Tiryns alone. As a hero favored by the gods, he founded and fortified the cities of Mycenae and Medea, ensuring that his legend would be immortalized. According to legend, Perseus called upon the one-eyed giants, the Cyclopes, to help build the massive walls of Mycenae, walls composed of stones so enormous that they could not be moved by human strength alone. Even today, these structures, known as the Cyclopean walls, stand as a testament to Perseus's power and his divine connections. Perseus and Andromeda lived a long and peaceful life in the lands of Tiryns and Mycenae, renowned for their unwavering loyalty to one another. Unlike many other Greek heroes and gods, Perseus remained faithful to Andromeda throughout his life and never took another woman. From their union came many children who laid the foundations for some of the most noble dynasties of the ancient world. Their eldest son, Perseus, had been born in Ethiopia before Perseus returned to Greece and was left there in the care of his grandfather, King Cepheus. According to mythological tradition, the line of Persian kings descended from this child. Perseus's other sons, Alcaeus, Sthenelus, Helios, Mestor, and Electrion, and his daughter Gorgophone were raised in Mycenae. This noble lineage paved the way to the greatest figure of Greek mythology, Heracles, Hercules. Perseus's son Alcaeus was the father of Amphitryon, who was regarded as the mortal father of Heracles, while another son, Electrion, was the father of Alcmena, Heracles' mother. Thus Heracles was a Perseid, descended from Perseus, on both his mother's and father's sides. As Heracles' birth approached, Zeus proclaimed that the child of Perseus's line born on that day shall rule over Mycenae. However, the jealous goddess Hera ensured that the throne would pass instead to Eurystheus, the son of Sthenelus and a grandson of Perseus, thereby condemning Heracles to a life of arduous labors. Perseus's heroism occupies a unique place in the ancient world, setting him apart from all others. As emphasized in Zera Akuyu's character analysis, Perseus did not endure a lifetime of suffering like Heracles, nor did he fall victim to his own hubris like Bellerophon. Instead, he consistently enjoyed the favor of the gods, appearing as a young, beautiful, never hesitating figure beloved by the Olympians. The gods bestowed upon him not only physical weapons, but also strategic counsel and spiritual strength. Despite having slain a tragic figure such as Medusa, Perseus's journey came to be regarded in the ancient world as the prototype of perfect heroism. At the end of their lives, Perseus and Andromeda were honored by the goddess Athena and placed among the stars. Today, the constellations of Perseus, Andromeda, Cepheus, and Cassiopeia that we see in the night sky stand as eternal reminders of this epic tale. Perseus secured his place among the legends not merely as a warrior who defeated monsters, but as a ruler who rejected hubris, listened to his conscience, and shaped the world through his lineage. Although mythological narratives exist in many different versions, the story of Perseus is always woven with themes of hope and the inevitability of fate. Born from a shower of gold, this demigod journeyed from the fishing boats of Seriphos to the golden walls of Mycenae, teaching humanity that it is possible to build one's destiny through divine will, and at the same time, to face the tragedies that destiny brings with honor and dignity. And so the long arc of fate, once bent by fear and prophecy, slowly returned to stillness. What began as a whispered warning in the halls of Delphi, what was sealed in bronze and cast upon the sea, did not end in chaos or vengeance, but in understanding. Perseus did not defeat destiny by fleeing from it, nor by breaking it with force. He fulfilled it by walking straight through its shadow, step by measured step, guided not only by divine gifts, but by discernment, restraint, and choice. The world remembers him as a slayer of monsters, yet monsters were never the true heart of his trial. It was fear that pursued him. It was injustice that shaped his path, and it was responsibility that tempered his strength. Medusa fell, but not into oblivion. Her gaze, once a curse, became a warning etched into shield and sky. Pegasus rose, not bound to blood or stone, but to wind and inspiration. Andromeda stood free, no longer an offering to the sea, but a queen beside a man who had learned that power gains meaning only when it protects rather than conquers. When Perseus returned to the lands of men, he did not cling to thrones stained by fear. He chose exile over arrogance, foundation over inheritance. In Mycenae, he did not merely raise walls of stone, he planted permanence. Cities grew where destiny had once threatened annihilation, and order replaced the long echo of prophecy. The lineage of Perseus is like an acorn planted deep within the soil. Just as that acorn grows across centuries, spreading its branches to shade an entire forest, the foundations Perseus laid in Mycenae gave rise to towering heroes such as Heracles, and shaped the fate of kingdoms yet unborn. Every drop of Zeus's golden rain that reached those roots bore its fruit not in a single lifetime, but in the endless continuity of history and among the eternal stars. Thus the child once abandoned to the mercy of the sea became a beginning rather than an ending. His story did not close with his final breath, nor did it vanish into myth alone. It continued in bloodlines, in cities, in constellations traced across the night sky. And when the gods looked upon his life, they did not remember only his victories, but his refusals. The throne he did not take, the vengeance he did not pursue, the fear he did not obey. So they placed him among the stars, not as a warning, but as a quiet testament, a reminder that even in a world governed by gods and fate, it is the measured courage of the human soul that leaves the longest shadow. Now the waves are calm, the prophecies have spoken their last word, the stone has softened into memory. You may rest. Let the ancient world fade gently from your thoughts, knowing that this journey has reached its end, not in silence, but in completion. Sleep peacefully. The story is finished.